The Whispering Manor. Prologue. The weight of ink and interest. The letter arrived not with a flourish, but with the heavy, dampened thud of a coffin lid closing. It was delivered to my cramped, subterranean apartment in the city, a space where the walls seemed to sweat with the humidity of my own desperation, and the air was thick with the scent of old paper and cheap tea. My name, Julian Thorne, was written across the envelope in a script so archaic and precise it felt less like handwriting and more like an incision. I was a man drowned in numbers that refused to add up. As a philologist specializing in the dead languages of the Levant, my expertise was as rare as it was unprofitable. The debt had begun as a trickle: student loans, the cost of a failed excavation in the Negev, the medical bills for my father's long, agonizing decline, and had swollen into a black tide. I owed money to institutions that sent polite letters, and later, to men who did not use paper at all. I was an academic of the forgotten, and I was being forgotten myself, erased by the mounting interest of a life I could no longer afford to lead. The letter was from a firm of solicitors I had never heard of, Pendergast, Ward, and Thorne. The name Thorne at the end was a coincidence or so. I thought then. It informed me with a cold legalistic detachment that I was the sole remaining heir to the estate of Lady Beatrice Thorne, my great-aunt thrice removed. I had a vague memory of her name from family trees. A woman of formidable intellect and even more formidable reclusiveness, who had vanished into the mist of the northern moors decades ago. The inheritance was not merely a house. It was the Whispering Manor, an estate situated in the Vale of Mourning, a geographic scar so remote it appeared on no modern GPS. The letter stated that the estate was unencumbered by debt and its contents. A library of unspeakable value, cret, were mine to dispose of as I saw fit. To a man being hunted by the shadow of bankruptcy, it was a reprieve. To a scholar of the ancient world, the mention of a library was a siren song. I sold what little I owned, packed my remaining books into a battered leather trunk, and boarded a train heading north. The journey was a slow transition from the gray, smog-choked reality of the city to a landscape that felt increasingly like a fever dream. The hills grew jagged, the trees twisted into arthritic shapes, and the sky turned the color of a bruised plum. By the time I reached the final station, a lonely platform of rotted wood and rusted iron, the sun had begun its descent, casting long skeletal shadows across the moor. A man was waiting for me. He was as thin as a winter branch, dressed in a suit that looked as though it had been fashioned from the funeral drapes of a Victorian parlor. He did not introduce himself. He merely gestured toward a horse-drawn carriage that looked like it belonged in a museum of the macabre. "The manor does not like to wait," he said. His voice was like the grinding of stones in a deep well. "I am Julian Thorne," I said, reaching out a hand that he ignored. "I know who you are," he replied. "The house has been expecting you for a very long time." As we jolted along the narrow, rock-strewn path that led into the vale, the silence of the landscape became a physical weight. There were no birds here, no rustle of small animals in the gorse. Only the rhythmic clop of the horse's hooves and the creaking of the carriage. The air grew colder, carrying the scent of damp earth, ancient stone, and something else. A faint metallic tang that set my teeth on edge. Then the manor appeared. It sat atop a jagged rise, a sprawling Gothic monstrosity of dark granite and soot-stained brick. Its windows were like black eyes, reflecting nothing. The architecture was a chaotic jumble of eras, Gothic arches, Tudor gables, and strange windowless towers that seemed to defy the laws of structural integrity. It did not look like a place built for the living. It looked like a monument to the endurance of the dead. "The Whispering Manor," the driver whispered, and for the first time I felt a prickle of unease. The gates were made of iron, twisted into the shapes of weeping willows and thorns. As they swung open, they didn't creak. They let out a long, low moan that vibrated in my chest. We pulled up to the front doors, massive slabs of oak bound in blackened steel. The driver helped me with my trunk, his movements stiff and mechanical. Once the trunk was on the porch, he climbed back onto the carriage without a word. "Wait!" I called out. "When will you return? How do I get back to the station?" He looked at me then, his eyes two hollow pits in the twilight. "The manor provides what is needed, Mr. Thorne, and it takes what is owed. You will find that there is no need for a return journey." With a crack of the whip, he vanished into the fog. I was left alone in the deepening dark, standing before the door of my inheritance. I reached for the heavy iron knocker, shaped like a withered hand, and as I touched it, I felt a jolt of static, a spark of energy that felt like a tiny, needle-sharp bite. The door did not wait for me to knock. It swung inward on silent hinges, revealing a cavernous entrance hall bathed in the amber glow of 1,000 flickering candles. There was no one there to light them. I stepped inside, and the door closed behind me with a finality that echoed through the very marrow of my bones. The descent, the architecture of dread. The first few days in the Whispering Manor were a blur of exploration and mounting disorientation. The house was a labyrinth. Corridors turned at impossible angles. Staircases led to dead ends or to doors that opened onto solid brick walls. Every surface was covered in a layer of dust that seemed to shimmer like powdered bone. My great-aunt Beatrice had been a collector, but not of art or finery. Every room was filled with curiosities that defied explanation. Jars containing unidentifiable biological specimens preserved in yellowing formaldehyde, clocks that ticked in reverse or had no hands at all. Mirrors that were so clouded they seemed to show a room other than the one I was standing in. But it was the library that truly captivated me. It was a cathedral of knowledge, 3 stories high, with shelves that reached into the darkness of the vaulted ceiling. Thousands of volumes, many bound in human skin, or something uncomfortably like it, lined the walls. Here I found the works I had only heard of in whispers, the Codex Umbra, the Libri Mortuorum, and the personal journals of Beatrice Thorne herself. As I began to catalog the collection, the whispers started. At first, I dismissed them as the wind whistling through the ancient masonry, or the settling of the house's heavy bones. They were faint sibilant sounds, like the rustle of silk or the turning of a page. But as the days bled into weeks, the sounds grew more distinct. They weren't just noises, they were voices. The glass. The glass will shatter at midnight. The blood is fresh on the white rose. He will fall. He will fall when the clock strikes 13. I sat at the massive mahogany desk in the library, my pen trembling over my notebook. I was an academic, a man of logic and linguistics. I tried to analyze the whispers, to find their root in some phonetic pattern, but they were elusive, shifting their tone and timbre whenever I tried to focus on them. The debt I had fled still haunted my dreams, but here it took on a different form. I felt a constant, gnawing hunger, though the pantry was inexplicably stocked with fresh bread, meat, and wine every morning. I felt a coldness that no hearth fire could warm, and I felt a presence, a heavy, suffocating awareness that I was being watched. I found the portrait of the matriarch in the great gallery. Lady Beatrice Thorne was depicted in a dress of midnight velvet, her hair a crown of silver, her eyes 2 piercing shards of ice. She held a silver key in one hand and a withered rose in the other. Her expression was not one of grandmotherly affection, but of a terrifying, predatory patience. As I stared at the portrait, the air in the gallery grew frigid. My breath misted in the air. I looked down and saw my shadow on the floor. It was wrong. It didn't mimic my posture. It was slumped. Its throat cut, a dark stain spreading across the shadow floor. I gasped and jumped back, but when I looked again, my shadow was normal. Stress, I whispered to the empty room. Isolation and malnutrition. But the house knew better. The whispers began to change. They were no longer vague prognostications. They began to speak of me. Julian. Julian will find the key in the belly of the crow. Julian will bleed from the eyes before the moon wanes. I became obsessed with the journals. Beatrice's handwriting was a frantic, jagged scrawl that grew more erratic toward the end of her life. She wrote of the debt of the future and the payment of breath. She spoke of the house as a living entity, a Chronos parasite that fed on the events it witnessed. The manor does not remember the past, she wrote in an entry dated shortly before her disappearance. The past is a husk, a dry skin shed by the snake of time. The manor sees the ripening fruit of what is to come. It sees the deaths that have not yet happened, the tragedies that are still in the womb of the future, and it demands to be fed. It requires a witness. It requires a matriarch to oversee the harvest. I felt a cold dread settle in my stomach. I looked at my hands, which were shaking. I had come here to escape my debts. But I realized with a sickening clarity that I had merely traded one creditor for another, and this one did not want money. One night, as I was walking through the third-floor corridor toward my bedroom, I heard a sound that made my heart stop. It was the sound of a woman weeping, a low, guttural sob that seemed to come from behind the wallpaper. I followed the sound, my candle flickering in the sudden draft. The sobbing led me to a door I had not noticed before. It was small, hidden behind a heavy tapestry. I pushed it open and found myself in a room that felt like the heart of the house. It was a nursery, but it was a nursery of nightmares. The crib was made of black iron, and the toys were dolls with their eyes sewn shut and their limbs rearranged. In the center of the room stood a woman. She was tall, her form draped in tattered gray lace that floated around her as if she were underwater. Her face was a pale mask of sorrow, her eyes weeping a thick black fluid that looked like ink. This was the restless matriarch. This was Beatrice, or what remained of her. She didn't move, but the whispers in the room became a deafening roar. The heir has come. The witness is here. The debt will be paid in the currency of the unborn. I tried to scream, but no sound came out. The matriarch turned her head toward me, her neck snapping with the sound of dry wood. She raised a skeletal hand and pointed at my chest. "You think you are here to inherit," she said, her voice a chorus of 1,000 dying breaths. "But you are here to serve. The house has seen your end, Julian Thorne. It has seen the way you die, and it is hungry for the spectacle." I turned and fled, my boots thudding on the floorboards like a panicked heartbeat. I ran through the shifting corridors, the walls seemingly closing in around me. The candles flickered out one by one, leaving me in a suffocating darkness. I reached my bedroom and slammed the door, locking it and bracing my back against the wood. I stayed there until dawn, listening to the whispers that now lived inside my own head. They told me of accidents that would happen a year from now. They told me of the deaths of people I hadn't even met yet. They told me of the fire that would eventually consume the manor, and the way the smoke would taste in my lungs. The descent was complete. I was no longer a guest in the Whispering Manor. I was a prisoner of its foresight. The climax, the loom of fate. The final week was a descent into madness. I stopped eating. The food provided by the house began to look like what it truly was, rot disguised as sustenance. The wine tasted of copper and old pennies. I spent my hours in the library, not cataloging, but searching for a way out, a loophole in the spiritual contract I had inadvertently signed. The whispers were now a constant, screaming presence. They told me about the death of the solicitor, Mr. Pendergast, a heart attack in 3 days' time. They told me about a war that would break out in a decade. But most of all, they spoke of the final payment. I saw the matriarch everywhere. She was in the reflections of the darkened windows. She was in the shadows that stretched across the rugs. She was the cold wind that blew through the locked doors. She wasn't haunting me. She was preparing me. The realization hit me like a physical blow on the 7th night. I was in the great gallery staring at the portrait of Beatrice. I noticed something I hadn't seen before. In the background of the painting, hidden in the shadows behind the matriarch, was another figure. It was a man, sitting at a desk, his face contorted in a silent scream as his shadow bled out beneath him. It was me. The portrait wasn't a record of the past. It was a map of the future. The house didn't house ghosts of the dead. It was a reservoir for the ghosts of the yet-to-be dead. The restless matriarch wasn't Beatrice Thorne's spirit haunting her old home. She was the manifestation of Beatrice's future death, a permanent loop of the moment she ceased to be. And now, the house wanted my future. It wanted the energy of my impending demise to sustain its own unnatural existence. The whispering wasn't the dead talking to the living. It was the future screaming at the present. Suddenly, the manor began to groan. The floorboards buckled, and the walls began to bleed. Not red blood, but a thick, translucent ichor that smelled of ozone and ancient dust. The candles flared into a brilliant, blinding white, then vanished into total darkness. I ran. I ran for the front door, but the hallway stretched out before me, becoming an infinite tunnel of gray stone. I turned and ran the other way, but found myself back in the library. The books were flying off the shelves, their pages tearing themselves out and swirling in the air like a storm of white moths. The matriarch appeared at the top of the gallery stairs. She was no longer weeping, she was laughing. A sound like glass breaking in a vacuum. "The payment is due, Julian," she shrieked. "The house has seen your death. It has tasted the moment your heart stops. Give it to us. Give us the future you will never live." I stumbled into the center of the library, tripping over a pile of fallen books. I looked down and saw my own body, my future body, lying on the floor. It was pale, withered, and covered in the same gray lace the matriarch wore. I saw myself dying of old age, of loneliness, of the very debt that had driven me here. The house wasn't just witnessing my death, it was accelerating it. It was pulling the future into the now, stripping away the years of my life to feed its hunger for the event. "No!" I screamed, grabbing a heavy brass lamp from the desk. "I won't give it to you." I swung the lamp at the matriarch, but it passed through her like smoke. She drifted closer, her fingers, long, translucent needles, reaching for my eyes. "You have no choice," she whispered, her voice now coming from inside my own throat. "The debt is written in the walls. The house has already seen you die here. You cannot change what has already been witnessed." I felt a sudden, sharp pain in my chest. My heart began to flutter like a trapped bird. The air in the room grew thin, as if the house were sucking the oxygen out of the future. I saw images of my life that hadn't happened yet. A woman I might have loved, a book I might have written, a quiet afternoon in a park I would never visit. All of it was being pulled out of me, consumed by the shadows of the manor. I collapsed to my knees. The floor beneath me felt like liquid. I was sinking into the wood, into the history of the house, but then I saw it. The silver key in the matriarch's hand in the portrait, she held it. In her ghostly form, she held it. It wasn't a key to a door. It was a key to the clock. The great clock of the manor stood in the entrance hall, a massive, obsidian-faced monstrosity that I had never seen run. It was the heart of the house's temporal hunger. With a final, desperate burst of energy, I surged to my feet. I ignored the phantom pains in my chest and the whispers that were trying to drown out my thoughts. I ran toward the entrance hall, the matriarch howling behind me. The house tried to stop me. The stairs turned into a slide of ice. The doors slammed shut. The very air became as thick as molasses, but I was a man who had lived his whole life under the weight of debt. I knew how to move when the world was trying to crush me. I reached the great clock. It was 10 feet tall, carved with scenes of the zodiac and the stages of human decay. I grabbed the heavy iron weights and pulled. The clock groaned. The matriarch let out a scream that shattered the remaining windows. "Stop," she cried. "If you break the cycle, you break yourself." "I'd rather be nothing than a meal for this house," I roared. I grabbed a heavy iron poker from the nearby fireplace and jammed it into the gears of the clock. There was a sound of grinding metal, a shower of sparks, and then a deafening crack. The world seemed to turn inside out. The shadows were sucked back into the walls. The matriarch disintegrated into a cloud of gray ash. The whispers rose to a fever pitch, a cacophony of every future death the house had ever seen, and then silence. Absolute, crushing silence. I fell to the floor, gasping for air. The manor was still there, but it felt different. It felt empty. The oppressive weight of the future was gone. The candles were out, and the only light came from the cold gray dawn, filtering through the shattered windows. I dragged myself to my feet, my body aching, as if I had aged 50 years in a single night. I looked at my hands. They were thin, the skin papery and translucent. My hair, once dark, was now the color of ash. I had won, but the price had been paid. The house had taken the years it wanted, but it had lost its grip on my end. I walked to the front door. It was no longer a heavy, sentient barrier. It was just a piece of rotted wood. I pushed it open and stepped out onto the porch. The Vale of Mourning was no longer a place of dread. It was just a lonely, desolate valley. The mist was lifting, revealing a world that was indifferent to my survival. I began to walk. I didn't look back at the manor. I knew that within its walls, the library was now just a collection of old paper, and the whispers had been silenced forever. As I reached the gates, I looked down at the ground. There, in the mud, was a single white rose. It was fresh, vibrant, and untouched by decay. I picked it up, and then I heard it, a faint, distant whisper, not from the house, but from the air itself. Julian will die in a small room surrounded by books with the scent of a white rose in the air. I smiled. It was a quiet, peaceful death, a future I could live with. I walked toward the station, a man with no money, no home, and a body that was failing him. But for the first time in my life, the debt was paid in full. I was no longer haunted by what was to come. I was simply living in the now, a ghost of the future, finally free to meet my end on my own terms. The Whispering Manor stood silent behind me, a hollow shell of stone and secrets, waiting for the next heir to bring it the one thing it could no longer see, the truth of the present. Epilogue. The echo in the ink. Years have passed since I left the Vale of Mourning. I live now in a small cottage by the sea, far from the jagged moors and the suffocating history of my family. My work as a philologist is over. My eyes are too weak for the fine script of ancient scrolls, and my hands shake too much to hold a pen for long. I live on the proceeds of the few items I took from the manor, small, non-cursed antiquities that fetched a decent price at auction. The debt collectors eventually stopped calling. Perhaps they thought I had died in the north. In a way, I had. The white rose I picked that morning never withered. It sits in a vase on my desk, as fresh as the day it was plucked. It is my only companion, a silent witness to the quiet life I have built. Sometimes, in the stillness of the night, when the wind blows off the ocean and rattles the shutters, I think I hear a faint rustle, a sound like silk, a sound like a page turning. I do not fear it. I know the manor is still there, perched on its hill, cold and empty. I know that somewhere in its dark heart, the gears of the great clock are still jammed with my iron poker. It is a house without a future, a predator that has been blinded. But I also know that time is a circle, not a line. The whispers I heard weren't just the house's visions. They were the echoes of a reality that is always happening. Somewhere, Beatrice is still weeping. Somewhere, I am still running through those shifting halls. I look at the rose. Its scent is heavy in the air, sweet, cloying, and final. I feel a familiar flutter in my chest, a gentle slowing of the rhythm. I have known my whole life. I sit back in my chair and close my eyes. The room is small. The shelves are full of books. The scent of the rose is everywhere. The debt is paid, the future is here, and it is finally blessedly silent. The silence, I realize with a cold, hollow jolt, was not the absence of sound, but the presence of a great held breath. It began with the rose. I had stared at its pristine, snowy petals for years, marveling at their defiance of time. But as my own heart slowed, a single drop of liquid fell from the flower's center. It was not dew. It was a thick, translucent ichor, smelling of ozone and ancient, disturbed dust. It struck the mahogany of my desk with a sound like a hammer hitting a coffin lid, a heavy, wet thud that vibrated through my brittle bones. I tried to lift my hand to wipe it away, but my fingers felt as though they were made of lead, or perhaps of the same cooling iron as the poker I had jammed into the manor's heart. My eyes, filmed with the cataracts of my stolen years, drifted to the bookshelf. The titles of my beloved volumes were changing. The gold leaf lettering didn't just fade, it squirmed. The history of the North became the ledger of Julian. A philologist's guide shifted into the anatomy of a debt. The walls of my small cottage, which I had painted a warm, comforting cream, to ward off the memory of the gray stone, began to weep. The paint bubbled and peeled back in long, sickly strips, revealing not the timber and lath of a seaside home, but the cold, sweating granite of the Vale of Mourning, the scent of the sea. The salt, the brine, the screaming gulls, was being devoured. In its place came the cloying, suffocating aroma of funeral lilies and the metallic tang of a butcher's shop. I tried to scream, but my throat was a dry well, lined with the ash of the matriarch's remains. "The debt," a voice whispered, not from the air, but from the marrow of my own spine. "The debt is not a currency of time, Julian. It is a currency of presence." The floorboards beneath my feet began to liquefy. My chair, the one I had sat in for a decade of false peace, began to merge with the floor. I wasn't dying in a small room surrounded by books. I was being reabsorbed. The cottage was a scab the manor had allowed to form over my mind while it digested the rest of my soul. I looked down at my hands. The papery translucent skin was no longer mine. It was turning into gray lace. The very fabric the matriarch had worn was spinning itself out of my pores, weaving a shroud that bound my arms to the armrests of the chair. The great clock, I could hear it now. It wasn't in the entrance hall of a distant manor. It was beating behind my ribs. Tick. My left lung collapsed. Tock. My right kidney failed. The iron poker hadn't broken the gears. It had merely become the new pendulum, and I was the weight that kept it swinging. The room began to stretch. The windows, which had looked out onto a gray sea, now looked inward. I saw the library. I saw the storm of white moths, the pages of my life, still swirling in the air, and there, standing in the center of the vortex, was the silhouette of a man. He was young. He was desperate. He was carrying a brass lamp. I watched him, watched myself, trip over the pile of books. I saw him look down at the floor with an expression of pure, unadulterated horror. I tried to warn him. I tried to tell him that the future he saw, the pale, withered body in gray lace, was not a possibility to be avoided, but a destination that had already been reached. I was the corpse he was looking at. I had always been the corpse. The years I had lived by the sea were merely the time it took for the manor's digestive juices to break down the memory of my resistance. The young Julian in the vision looked into my eyes. He didn't see a grandfatherly figure. He saw a monster. He saw the end of all things. "No," his voice echoed, a tinny, distant sound from a world of light I no longer inhabited. "I won't give it to you." He swung the lamp. I felt the impact, not on my physical form, but on the very structure of my consciousness. The glass of my cottage windows shattered inward, the shards hanging in the air like frozen diamonds. The white rose on my desk began to grow, its thorny vines lashing out to wrap around my throat, its roots digging deep into the soft tissue of my neck. The matriarch appeared beside me. She wasn't a ghost anymore. She was the architecture itself. Her face was the ceiling, her eyes were the flickering candles, her laughter was the grinding of the stone walls. As the manor settled deeper into the earth, "You thought you broke the cycle, little bird," she hissed, her breath smelling of the ink I had used to write my useless philological treatises. "But a circle has no beginning and no end. You didn't jam the clock, you became the gear that was missing." The walls of the cottage finally fell away entirely, dissolving into a mist of gray lace and bone dust. I was back. I was in the library, sitting in the high-backed chair that had waited for me since the day I was born. The great clock in the hall let out a chime that shook the foundations of the world. A deep, resonant boom that signaled the arrival of the event. The event wasn't my death, it was my permanence. I watched the young Julian turn and run toward the entrance hall, his footsteps echoing with a hollow, frantic rhythm. I wanted to laugh, but the rose vines had already filled my mouth, the petals blossoming in my throat, sweet and final. The manor groaned in satisfaction. The bleeding walls turned from translucent ichor to a deep, bruised purple. The books on the shelves settled, their pages turning to stone, their secrets locked away in a language that no one left alive could read. I felt a sudden, sharp clarity. The debt wasn't something I owed to the house. The house was the debt. Every brick, every floorboard, every whisper was a piece of a family that had refused to pass away, a lineage that had folded itself into the very fabric of reality, to avoid the indignity of the grave, and now I was the newest brick. I was the latest whisper. My vision began to fade, but it didn't go to black. It went to gray, the eternal, unchanging gray of the Vale. I looked at the white rose, now growing directly out of my chest, its roots intertwined with my still-beating, mechanical heart. It was beautiful. It was a masterpiece of parasites. "Julian," the house whispered, 1,000 voices speaking as one. "Julian is here. Julian has always been here. Julian will always be here." Outside the shattered windows of the library, the mist began to roll back in. But it didn't reveal a world indifferent to my survival. It revealed the next carriage. I heard the sound of wheels on the gravel drive. I heard the rhythmic clip-clop of a horse that had no breath. I heard the heavy thud of the front door being pushed open. The door I thought I had left as rotted wood, but which was now a maw of polished obsidian. A new heir was stepping into the hall. I could hear his heartbeat, fast, thrumming, full of the delicious, wasted energy of the living. He would find the library, he would find the books. And eventually, he would find me sitting in this chair, a silent sentinel in gray lace, holding a white rose that would never die. I tried to move my hand, to wave him away, to signal the trap, but all I could do was twitch a single translucent finger. The young man's footsteps grew louder. He was climbing the stairs. He was coming toward the library. "Is anyone there?" he called out. His voice was trembling. It was a voice I knew well. It was the voice of a man who believed in the future. I felt a surge of a new kind of hunger. It wasn't my hunger. It belonged to the floorboards, the walls, the very air I was forced to breathe. The manor wanted to show him his death. It wanted to taste the moment his heart stopped, and I, the new matriarch of this hollow kingdom, realized with a cold, sickening horror that I wanted to watch. The door to the library creaked open, a sliver of light, cold, gray, and predatory, spilled across the floor, illuminating the pile of fallen books. The young man stepped inside. He was holding a lantern, its flame flickering against the encroaching shadows. He looked at the shelves, at the swirling dust, and then his eyes traveled to the center of the room. "He saw me," he gasped, the lantern shaking in his grip. Who are you?" I couldn't speak. The rose vines tightened around my windpipe, but the house spoke for me. The whispers rose from the floorboards, a cacophony of every death the manor had ever witnessed. "The payment is due," the walls hissed. The young man backed away, but the door behind him didn't just slam. It vanished. The hallway was gone. The exit was a wall of solid stone, weeping that familiar, ozone-scented ichor. I just came for the inheritance," the young man stammered, dropping his lantern. The glass broke, but the flame didn't go out. It grew, turning a brilliant, blinding white, the same light that had heralded my own undoing. I watched him struggle. I watched him run toward the windows, only to find them replaced by mirrors that showed him not his reflection, but his decay. I watched him scream as the books began to fly, their pages tearing themselves out to form a shroud for his own future. And then I felt it, a phantom pain in my chest, a flutter. He was reaching for a heavy brass lamp on the desk. "No," he whispered, his voice cracking. "I won't give it to you." The cycle was beginning again. The great clock, housed within my own ribcage, gave a triumphant thud. The iron poker was still there, but it wasn't a jam. It was the needle of a record. playing the same symphony of dread over and over, forever. I looked at the white rose in my hand. A petal fell. It struck the floor and turned into a drop of blood. The young man turned to me, his face a mask of terror. "Help me," he begged. I leaned forward, the gray lace of my sleeves rustling like dead leaves. With an effort that felt like tearing my own soul apart, I managed to whisper a single word through the thorns in my throat. "Run." But the house laughed. The sound was like glass breaking in a vacuum, a sound that swallowed his scream and my warning alike. The manor began to groan. The floorboards buckled, the walls began to bleed, and as the young man surged toward the entrance hall, driven by a desperate, futile hope, I settled back into my chair. I closed my eyes, but I could still see. I could see the great clock waiting for him. I could see the iron weights. I could see the moment he would try to break the heart of the house, only to find that the house has no heart, only a stomach. The scent of the rose grew stronger, cloying and final. The debt was being paid. Again, and again and again, in the silence of the library, I began to hum a tune I hadn't thought of in a century. A nursery rhyme about a man who went to sea in a boat made of paper. The words were gone, replaced by the rhythm of the ticking clock, but the melody remained, a thin silver thread in a world of gray stone. "Julian," the house whispered, tenderly this time. "Julian, look at the rose." I looked. A new bud was forming at the center of the flower. It was small, vibrant, and untouched by decay. It was the color of a young man's scream. The manor settled. The whispers subsided into a low, contented hum. The hunt was over, and the meal had begun. Somewhere in the distance, I heard the sound of a heavy iron poker hitting the floor, followed by a deafening crack. I smiled, though I had no lips. The future was here, and it was exactly as I remembered. The silence that followed the crack was not an absence of sound, but a physical weight, a suffocating velvet that pressed against the eardrums until they throbbed with the rhythm of the house's slow tectonic digestion. The young man's scream had been truncated, clipped off as if by a guillotine of shadow, leaving only the dying echo of his terror to bounce off the stone-bound books. I felt the vibration of his fall through the soles of my feet. Feet that were no longer flesh, but calcified roots seeking purchase in the floorboards. The manor let out a long, shuddering sigh. It was the sound of air escaping a collapsed lung, a draft that carried the scent of wet copper and ancient sunless dust. The lantern he had dropped lay on its side near the obsidian maw where the door had been. Its flame did not gutter. Instead, it began to bleed. The light turned thick and viscous, pooling on the floor like spilled mercury, illuminating the transformation of the library. The mirrors that had replaced the windows were no longer showing the boy's decay. They were showing mine. I saw a figure draped in diaphanous shrouds of gray lace, a silhouette woven from spiderwebs and sorrow. My face was a pale oval of porcelain, cracked by the emergence of the white rose, whose thorns now traced the delicate line of my jaw, stitching my mouth into a permanent, mournful arc. "He is slow to settle," the matriarch's voice murmured, though she was nowhere and everywhere. Her presence was the chill in the marrow of my bones. They always are, when they bring such vibrant hope with them. Hope is a fibrous meat. It takes longer to break down. I looked down at my hands. The skin was translucent, the color of skimmed milk, revealing the clockwork gears that now turned beneath the surface. My veins were copper wires, pulsing with a rhythmic, golden ichor. I was no longer a man who studied languages. I was the language the house used to write its own history. The young man, Julian, or whatever name he had carried into this maw, was not dead, not in the way the living understand the term. I could feel him through the floorboards. He was in the crawl space, between the seconds of the great clock's ticking. He was the frantic scratching behind the wainscoting, the sudden cold spot in the center of the room, the static electricity that made the hair on one's arms stand up. He was being processed, his memories stripped away like layers of wallpaper to reveal the raw, screaming wood beneath. I tried to turn my head toward the sound of his weeping. A sound that was now indistinguishable from the wind whistling through the eaves. But the rose vines tightened, a cruel reminder of my station. I was the centerpiece. I was the silent witness. The library began to expand. The shelves stretched upward, disappearing into a vaulted gloom where the ceiling had once been. The books, those calcified tombs of forgotten thought, began to pulse. I realized with a jolt of necrotic horror that they weren't just stone. They were ossified hearts, each one a record of a soul that had been folded into the manor's ledger. A sudden sharp heat flared in my chest. The bud at the center of the white rose, the one the color of a scream, began to unfurl. As it opened, a vision flooded my mind, unbidden and searing. I saw the basement, not the cellar I had known, with its jars of preserves and smell of damp earth, but the true basement. It was a cathedral of bone, where the foundations of the manor rested upon the rib cages of giants. There the young man was being woven. Shadowy spindles, operated by hands made of smoke, were wrapping him in the same gray lace that adorned my sleeves. He was being prepared for his own chair, his own room, his own eternity of silence. "The debt is never paid," I whispered, the words rattling like dry seeds in a gourd. "It is only refinanced." The manor groaned in agreement, a deep sub-bass rumble that shook the inkwell on the desk. The ink within, blacker than a starless night, began to crawl over the rim, forming itself into spindly arachnid legs. It skittered across the blotter, trailing a line of text in a script that burned my eyes to look upon. "The heir is the harvest." I looked at the great clock. Its face was no longer marked with numbers, but with names. Most were faded, worn away by the friction of centuries, but one name was glowing with a fresh, raw luminescence: Julian. And beneath it, a space was already clearing for the next. The clatter of the horse's hooves outside had stopped. But the carriage remained. It would always remain, a phantom vessel waiting for the next soul brave, or foolish enough to claim an inheritance of shadows. I felt a phantom limb move. Not my arm, but a piece of the wall near the fireplace. I was learning to flex the manor's muscles. I reached out with a thought, and a heavy velvet curtain in the hallway drew itself shut, plunging the space into a more profound darkness. It felt satisfying. A cold, predatory thrill raced through my mechanical heart. The hunger I had felt earlier was no longer an intrusion. It was a beckoning. I looked at the white rose. A second petal fell. This one didn't turn to blood. It turned into a small silver key. It landed on the floor with a chime that echoed through every room of the house, from the weeping cellar to the shrieking attic. It was the key to the library door. The door that no longer existed. "Pick it up," the house commanded. The voice was no longer the matriarch's alone. It was a chorus of the calcified hearts on the shelves. I fought the impulse. I gripped the arms of my chair until the wood groaned, but my hand moved of its own accord, a jerked puppet's motion. My translucent fingers closed around the silver key. It was freezing, a sliver of absolute zero that threatened to shatter my crystalline skin. As I held it, the mirrors on the walls shifted again. They no longer showed me. They showed the front gates of the estate, miles away, shrouded in a mist that never lifted. A figure was standing there. It was a woman. She was dressed in mourning clothes that looked a century out of date, holding a suitcase that seemed to weigh more than she did. She was looking up the long, winding drive toward the manor, her face a mask of weary determination. She took a step forward. Then another. The manor's excitement was a physical thing, a sudden surge of heat that made the ichor in the walls bubble and hiss. The great clock's ticking accelerated, a frantic, expectant heartbeat. "Who is she?" I asked, my voice a rasp of dry leaves. The matriarch's laughter was a cascade of falling glass. "She is the solution to a problem you haven't realized you have yet, little bird. She is the one who will tend the garden." I looked down at the white rose growing from my chest. Its roots were no longer just in my neck. They were spreading, weaving through the fabric of my chair, stitching me into the very wood and velvet. I was becoming the throne I sat upon, The woman at the gate reached out and touched the iron bars. They didn't creak. They sang a high, melodic note that vibrated through the silver key in my hand. I realized then that the event was not a single moment. It was a slow-motion collision that lasted for lifetimes. The young man was still screaming in the walls, his voice becoming a decorative flourish in the manor's architecture, while the woman was already beginning her descent into the same trap. The rosebud, the one the color of a scream, fully opened inside. Instead of stamens and pistils, there was a tiny, perfect replica of the manor, and through its microscopic windows, I could see a tiny, perfect replica of myself, sitting in a chair, holding a rose. The cycle didn't just repeat, it nested. It was an infinity of horrors, each one smaller and more concentrated than the last. I leaned back, the gray lace of my veil falling over my eyes like a shroud. The woman had passed through the gates. The mist had closed behind her, a wall of gray cotton that erased the world beyond the estate. The manor began to hum its nursery rhyme again. The melody now reinforced by the woman's distant, rhythmic footsteps on the gravel. 1 for the debt and 2 for the dread, 3 for the crown upon the dead. I watched her through the mirrors, my new eyes. I watched her pause to look at a withered oak tree, unaware that its branches were fashioned from the arms of those who had tried to climb over the walls. I watched her adjust her shawl against a wind that didn't exist. I felt a sudden, sharp sting in my palm. The silver key was melting, the metal soaking into my skin, turning my hand into a permanent tool of the house. I was the lock and the key. I was the door and the wall. "Julian," I whispered, but I didn't know which Julian I was talking to anymore. The one in the walls, the one I used to be, or the one the house was already preparing to manufacture from the woman's arrival. The front door, the obsidian maw, began to creak open, even though she was still minutes away. It was an invitation. It was a threat. The white rose pulsed with a soft, sickly light. The debt was being called, and for the first time, I didn't want to warn her. I wanted to see the color of her soul when the house finally broke the seal. The silver key, now a liquid mercury coursing through the conduits of my palm, didn't just merge with my flesh, it rewrote the cartography of my nerves. I could feel the front door's lock, a complex, multi-tumbler beast of cold iron, as if it were my own teeth. I felt the woman's gloved hand reach for the knocker, a heavy brass gargoyle whose eyes were 2 flat, unblinking emeralds. Before she could strike, the house exhaled. The front doors didn't just swing open. They retreated, the heavy obsidian slabs folding into the walls, with a sound like a tomb being unsealed. She stood on the threshold, framed by the suffocating gray mist of the valley. Her name, I realized, was Elara. I didn't know how I knew it, only that the house had already digested her birth certificate, her childhood letters, and the salt of her tears. The information was fed to me through the rose's roots, a bitter, ink-stained broth of her history. She was a woman of sharp angles and soft grief, her black veil a thin membrane between her and the predatory heir of the manor. "Hello," she whispered. Her voice was a fragile thing, a glass bird released into a storm of iron. The sound vibrated through the floorboards, traveling up the legs of my chair, my body, and settled in the gears of my chest. I felt the urge to answer, to scream a warning that would shatter the windows, but the copper wires in my throat only hummed with the manor's low, resonant hunger. "Welcome home, daughter of the drought." The matriarch's voice didn't come from the air this time. It came from the shadows beneath Elara's own feet. Elara stepped into the foyer. The moment her boot touched the checkerboard marble, carved from the kneecaps of martyrs, I now suspected the great clock in the library gave a thunderous, shuddering stroke. 1. The sound was a physical blow. It sent a ripple through the wallpaper, making the floral patterns writhe like a bed of disturbed snakes. Elara gasped, her hand flying to her throat, her fingers brushing a locket that pulsed with a faint, dying warmth. I watched her through the eyes of the portraits lining the grand staircase. I was the stern colonel with the missing eye. I was the pale maiden with the bleeding hands. I saw her from a dozen angles at once, a kaleidoscopic feast of her vulnerability. She looked so small beneath the vaulted ceiling, where the shadows were thick enough to have weight, hanging down like the wattles of some ancient cosmic bird. "Is anyone here?" she asked, her voice gaining a desperate edge. "I received a letter about the inheritance. The inheritance." I felt a phantom laugh rattle in my porcelain ribs. The inheritance was not the land, nor the gold, nor the title. It was the debt. It was the privilege of becoming a cog in a machine that ground time into dust. In the walls, Julian's scratching grew frantic. He was in the space behind the foyer's wainscoting now. I could see him. Not with eyes, but with the house's tactile intuition. He was a frantic smudge of pale light and raw nerves, his fingers worn down to the bone from clawing at the cedar planks. He was trying to warn her. He was trying to reach out and trip her, to send her falling back out the door before the obsidian slabs reclaimed their place. But the manor was faster. A rug, thick, crimson, and smelling faintly of old copper, unrolled itself toward her feet with the fluid grace of a tongue. It beckoned her toward the center of the house, toward the library, toward me. Alara hesitated, her gaze darting toward the shadows. She could hear Julian, though she didn't know it. To her, it was only the settling of an old house, the expansion of wood in the damp air. She didn't yet understand that in the Whispering Manor, nothing settled. It only grew more restless. I felt the matriarch's presence lean over me, though there was no weight on my shoulders. "Show her the way. Little bird," she hissed. "Twitch the thread. Let her see the beauty of her cage." My hand, the one infused with the silver key, rose of its own accord. I pointed toward the library door, miles away, or perhaps only inches. For distance was a lie the house told the living. A small blue flame ignited in a wall sconce. Then another, another. They formed a path of ghostly, flickering light that led her through the labyrinth of the ground floor. Alara followed. She had no choice. The mist outside had already solidified into a wall of granite, erasing the driveway, the carriage, and the very concept of an outside. As she walked, the house began to transform around her. The paintings she passed changed their subjects. The stern colonel was now a man with a clockwork heart. Me, and the pale maiden was now Alara herself, her mourning clothes replaced by the gray lace of the manor's chosen. She didn't notice yet. She was too busy staring at the ceiling. Where the plaster moldings were beginning to drip like melting wax, she reached the threshold of the library. The air here was different. It was thick with the scent of the white rose, a cloying, necrotic sweetness that made the lungs feel as though they were being lined with velvet. I sat in my chair, the center of the web. The rose vines had now completely encased my legs, fusing them with the mahogany carvings. My skin was so translucent now that the golden ichor was the only thing giving me shape. I was a ghost of brass and glass, a living reliquary. Alara stopped at the door. Her eyes widened as they fell upon me. I saw her reflection in my own metallic eyes, a tiny, terrified spark of humanity. "My God," she breathed, What have they done to you?" I tried to speak. I wanted to tell her to run, to find the basement, to find the cathedral of bone, and burn it all down. But when I opened my mouth, the only sound that emerged was the rhythmic tick-tock-tick of the great clock. The rose at my chest pulsed. A third petal fell. This one didn't turn to blood, and it didn't turn to silver. It turned into a swarm of tiny, translucent moths. They erupted from the floor, a cloud of pale wings that smelled of old paper and funeral incense. They swirled around Alara, not biting, but brushing against her skin with a soft, maddening insistence. "The garden must be tended," the chorus of the library whispered. The books on the shelves began to flap their covers like the wings of dying birds. Alara backed away, but the door she had entered through was gone. In its place was a wall of solid bone, the rib cages of the giants I had seen in my vision, woven together with the gray lace. "Who are you?" she cried out, her voice cracking. "Where is the matriarch?" "I am here, child." The voice came from the rose in my chest. I felt my ribcage crack open, the bone splitting like dry kindling. From the gap, a hand emerged. It was not a human hand, it was made of smoke and needles, draped in the same gray lace that Julian was currently being wrapped in. It reached out toward Alara, its fingers elongating, seeking the warmth of her throat. "You are the heir." The hand gestured with a sickening, fluid grace. "You are the one who will carry the seeds." The young man was the soil, the librarian is the record. But you are the bloom. Alara fell to her knees as the floor beneath her turned soft. Like quicksand made of hair, she began to sink. The manor groaned in pleasure, a vibration that made the mechanical gears in my head spin. So fast they began to glow white-hot. I felt a sudden sharp connection to her. The golden ichor in my veins surged, reaching out through the floorboards to touch her sinking form. For a moment our minds brushed. I saw her memories, a small house by the sea, the smell of salt and lavender, a father who had disappeared into the mist of this very estate 30 years ago. She wasn't here for the inheritance. She was here for him. He is in the basement. I tried to project the thought. He is the foundation. He is the weight that holds the manor down. But the thought was intercepted. The matriarch's laughter flared in my mind, a searing heat. "No secrets, little bird. We are all one family here, all one body, all one hunger." The library began to descend, not the room itself, but our perception of it. The floorboards became transparent, and we were suddenly hovering over the true basement, the cathedral of bone. Below us, Julian was no longer scratching. He was being stretched. His limbs were being elongated on racks made of obsidian, his tendons being pulled into long, shimmering strings. The shadowy spindles were weaving these strings into a massive, intricate tapestry that covered the entire ceiling of the basement. It was a map of every soul the manor had ever consumed, their lives woven into a geography of suffering. "Look, Alara," the matriarch commanded. "Look at your father's work." In the center of the tapestry, a figure was frozen in a scream of eternal silk. It was a man, his features distorted by the weaving, but the resemblance to Alara was unmistakable. He was the centerpiece of the previous generation, the one who had paved the way for her arrival. Alara screamed, a sound of pure, unadulterated tectonic grief. The sound was what the house had been waiting for. It was the catalyst, the ink that had skittered across the desk earlier. The arachnid script suddenly leapt into the air. It flew toward Alara, branding itself onto her skin. The letters burned into her forehead, her cheeks, her hands. The harvest is plentiful. She was being claimed. Not by a person, but by a history. I felt the rose vines tighten around my throat, pulling me deeper into the chair. My vision began to fragment. I was seeing the library, the basement, the gates, and the attic all at once. I was the nervous system of the manor, and every scream, every creak, every pulse of fear was a jolt of electricity through my copper wire nerves. The great clock struck again. 2. The rhythm of the house changed. The slow, mournful crawl of the processing accelerated. The shadows in the library began to solidify into figures. The previous inhabitants, the family. They were blurred, featureless things made of dust and lace, standing in the corners, watching with eyeless sockets. They began to chant, a sound like dry leaves being crushed in a fist. "The debt is the life. The life is the debt." Alara was chest-deep in the floor now. Her suitcase had been swallowed, its contents, her clothes, her photos, her hope, digested and turned into fuel for the manor's furnace. I felt a surge of something that wasn't mechanical hunger. It was a flicker of the man I had been, the one who studied languages. I realized the manor wasn't just a predator, it was a translator. It took human experience, pain, love, loss, and translated it into a language of stone and shadow so that it could endure forever. It was a monument to the things that should have been forgotten. And I was the scribe, my translucent fingers, still holding the phantom sensation of the silver key, began to move across the desk. I wasn't writing on paper. I was writing on the air itself, the golden ichor leaking from my fingertips to form glowing glyphs. I wasn't writing a warning. I was writing her entry into the ledger. Alara, daughter of Thomas, the bloom of the 30th year. As I wrote, the pain in my chest eased. The hunger became a calm, cold certainty. I looked at her, sinking into the floor, her face a mask of terror, and I felt envious. She still had so much to lose. She still had so much vibrant hope to be broken down. "Help me," she gasped, reaching a hand toward me. Her fingers were inches from my boots, which were now nothing more than polished ebony wood. I leaned forward, the gray lace of my veil brushing her fingertips. "There is no help," I whispered, and for the first time, my voice was perfectly synchronized with the ticking of the clock. "There is only the work. Do you not see the beauty of the pattern, Alara? Do you not see how perfectly you fit into the space your father left for you?" The rose at my chest began to glow with a fierce, blinding light. The miniature manor inside the bud opened its tiny front door. Inside, I saw a tiny Alara walking into a tiny library, looking at a tiny me. The nesting was complete. The basement below us erupted in a chorus of grinding bone. The shadowy spindles moved with a frantic, joyous speed. Julian's voice, now fully integrated into the architecture, became a haunting, melodic flute note that echoed through the vents. He was no longer a man. He was the air she would breathe. Alara's head was the only thing left above the floorboards. Her eyes met mine, and in that final moment of human recognition, I saw the light in them go out. Not because she was dead, but because she was being translated. The marble floor closed over her with a soft, wet click. Silence returned to the library, punctuated only by the great clock's steady, indifferent heartbeat. "She is a sturdy one," the matriarch murmured, her presence now radiating a warm, postprandial glow. "She will provide much finery for the upper floors. The attic has been so threadbare lately." I sat back in my throne. The rose vines had now reached my chest, weaving through the clockwork gears, binding the organic and the mechanical into a single, horrific symmetry. I looked at the great clock. Julian's name was already fading, becoming part of the background texture of the face. Alara's name was burning bright and gold, and beneath it, a new space was clearing. Outside, miles away at the edge of the mist, I felt the iron gates sing another note, another vibration. A new carriage was approaching. I felt the mechanical heart in my chest skip a beat in anticipation. I reached out with a thought and adjusted the velvet curtains in the hallway. I polished the mirrors with a gust of spectral wind. I made sure the blue flames in the sconces were trimmed and waiting. I was the librarian. I was the throne. I was the Whispering Manor, and the next volume was about to arrive. The marble where Alara had vanished did not merely settle. It healed. The stone pulsed once, a slow, viscous throb, before the grain of the rock knit itself back together into a seamless expanse of cold, gray-veined white. For a moment, a single lock of her hair remained, caught in the seam like a golden thread in a shroud, before it too was drawn downward, sucked into the thirsty marrow of the foundation. I felt the weight of her. She was no longer a girl. She was a structural necessity. Her grief had been pressurized, distilled into a dense, crystalline sorrow that now reinforced the sagging joists of the east wing. I could feel her down there, 3 stories below my boots, her consciousness being shredded into fine strips to line the nests of the attic things. "A fine vintage," the matriarch whispered. Her voice now a vibration in my very teeth. The rose in my chest unfurled its petals, and for a second I saw through its many layered eyes. I saw the basement, the cathedral of bone, where Julian was being spun. He was no longer recognizable as a man. He was a harp of sinew. The shadowy spindles, those tireless, multi-limbed weavers of the manor's history, were plucking at his elongated tendons. Each vibration sent a ripple of exquisite agony through the house, a frequency that kept the walls from crumbling. He was the music that filled the voids between the bricks. His eyes, fixed and glassy, were being used as lenses for the telescopes in the observatory, destined to stare forever at stars that had died 1 billion years ago. The attic, librarian, the matriarch commanded. It thirsts. The translation is never truly finished. It must be distributed. I rose from the throne of books. My joints didn't creak. They chimed. The golden ichor in my veins had reached a perfect equilibrium with the mechanical oil of my internal gears. I didn't walk so much as I was carried by the floor itself, the boards sliding like a conveyor belt beneath my feet, delivering me toward the spiral staircase that wound upward into the dark. The air grew thin and smelled of ancient, desiccated skin. This was the territory of the family. The husks of those who had come before, too hollow to be structural, too persistent to be discarded, they clung to the rafters like bats made of moth-eaten velvet. As I ascended, they turned their headless necks toward me, sensing the fresh ink I carried, the record of Ilera's transition. I reached the top landing. The door to the attic was a single slab of petrified tongue, rough and gray. It tasted the air as I approached. "Open," I commanded, my voice echoing with the authority of the great clock. The door peeled back, the sound like a wet bandage being ripped from a wound. Inside, the attic was a forest of hanging tapestries, the same ones Julian was currently being woven into. They shifted in a wind that came from nowhere, a draft of exhaled breaths from the lungs of the basement. I reached into the air and pulled the golden glyphs I had written earlier. Ilera, daughter of Thomas, the bloom of the 30th year, manifested in the physical realm. They were heavy, glowing with a sickly, phosphorescent light. I draped them over a hook made of a child's finger bone. Immediately, the attic things descended. They were featureless, draped in the gray lace that was the manor's signature. They began to feast on the letters, their hands, if they could be called hands, tearing at the golden light, stuffing the meaning of Ilara into their empty chest cavities. They would wear her memories like jewelry. They would mimic her father's gait in the hallways at night. They would ensure that nothing of her was wasted. I turned away, the hunger in my own belly replaced by a cold, humming void. Downstairs, the iron gates sang again. The sound was sharper this time, a high-pitched metallic shriek that pierced through the fog. I felt the vibration travel through the gravel driveway, up the stone steps, and into the soles of my feet. A new carriage. It was black, polished to a mirror sheen that reflected nothing but the gray mist. The horses were not horses. They were constructs of wire and wet leather, their eyes glowing with the same blue flame that flickered in the manor's sconces. They didn't pant. They hissed steam. The passenger emerged. I watched through the eyes of a stone gargoyle perched above the portico. He was a man of severe angles, dressed in a suit of such deep charcoal it seemed to absorb the meager light. He carried a leather doctor's bag, its brass buttons tarnished by a salt he hadn't encountered yet. He stood at the base of the steps, his face a mask of calculated skepticism. Dr. Silas Vane. I knew his name before he even thought it. The manor had already tasted him through the soles of his boots. He was a man of logic, a man who believed that every shadow had a source and every scream had a physiological explanation. He was a skeptic. The manor loved skeptics. Their breaking was always so much louder. "Welcome, Doctor." The house groaned, the sound disguised as the wind whistling through the eaves. Silas Vane adjusted his spectacles, his eyes scanning the facade of the manor. He didn't see the bone weave in the walls yet. He didn't see the way the windows blinked. He saw only a grand, decaying estate that required his professional services. He had been summoned to treat a malady of the soul in the current master of the house. He didn't realize that I was the master, and I was the malady. I descended the stairs, my form flickering between the librarian and the ghost of the man I used to be. I needed to appear human enough to draw him in. I adjusted the lace at my cuffs, which felt like cooling lead against my skin. By the time I reached the grand entrance hall, the heavy oak doors were already groaning open, operated by the invisible pulleys of the manor's will. The doctor stepped inside. The moment his heel hit the foyer's mosaic, a depiction of a titan being devoured by crows. The great clock in the library struck. 3. The sound was a physical blow. Silas Vane staggered, his hand flying to his chest as if his own heart had tried to sync with the pendulum. "Good evening, Dr. Vane," I said, stepping out of the shadows of the grandfather clock. My voice was a velvet rasp, the sound of a needle on a worn record. "We have been expecting you. The patient is in a state of flux." Vane recovered quickly, his professional veneer snapping back into place, though I could see the way his pupils blown wide. Trying to make sense of the shifting geometry of the hall, the walls were subtly leaning inward, an architectural embrace. "Mr. Thorne?" he asked, his voice tight. "The letter said the situation was urgent. I was told the master of the house was suffering from a sensory delusion." I smiled, and I felt the rose in my chest tighten its grip on my lungs. "A delusion, yes. He believes he is becoming the house. Or perhaps that the house is becoming him. It's a matter of perspective, really." I gestured toward the drawing room, where the fire in the hearth was burning a vivid, unnatural violet. The smoke didn't rise up the chimney. It curled along the ceiling like a questing serpent. "Please, leave your bag. The manor will see to your comforts." Vane gripped the handle of his bag tighter. "I prefer to keep my instruments with me. Now, where is the patient?" "He is everywhere," I whispered, leaning closer, the scent of ozone and rotting lilies wafted from my veil. "But for the sake of your diagnosis, we shall start in the conservatory. The glass there is particularly revealing." As we walked, the hallway began to stretch. The doors we passed became more numerous, their handles turning into brass ears that twitched as we spoke. Vane didn't notice the floorboards behind him, rising up to form a wall, sealing the exit. He didn't notice that the portraits on the walls were no longer of ancestors, but of him. Silas Vane. At various stages of decomposition, we reached the conservatory. It was a cathedral of glass and iron, choked with plants that didn't require sunlight. They fed on the shadows. Thick, fleshy vines with serrated edges hung from the dome, dripping a clear, caustic sap that hissed when it hit the floor. In the center of the room stood a large, ornate mirror draped in a heavy velvet cloth. "The patient is behind the veil, doctor," I said, my mechanical heart accelerating. "But I must warn you, his condition is contagious. Logic is a very poor shield against this particular infection." Vane stepped forward, his hand reaching for the velvet. I could see the tremors in his fingers. He sensed it now. The mounting dread, the way the house was breathing in time with his own frantic pulse. "I am a man of science," he muttered, more to himself than to me. "There is an explanation for the atmospheric pressure, for the optical illusions." "Science is merely a language, doctor," I replied, my shadow detaching itself from my feet and beginning to climb the glass walls. "But the manor speaks in a dialect of bone. Look at what you've really come here to cure." With a sharp tug, Vane pulled the velvet away. He didn't see a reflection, he saw a window. On the other side of the glass, he saw himself. But he was already translated. He was a collection of surgical tools, his skin replaced by the leather of his doctor's bag, his eyes turned into the brass knobs of a microscope. And behind this version of himself, Elara was there, her face pressed against the glass from the other side, her mouth open in a silent, eternal scream of silk. "What is this?" Vane shrieked, backing away. He tripped, not over a rug, but over a root that had suddenly erupted from the tile. The root wasn't wood. It was a human arm, calcified and gray, the fingers reaching for his ankle. "This is the diagnosis, doctor," I said, my voice now coming from every corner of the room at once. "The manor isn't sick, it's just growing." The glass of the conservatory began to vibrate. The high-pitched note of the iron gates returned, amplified 1,000 times. The panes didn't shatter, they began to liquefy, dripping down the frames like hot wax. The plants began to move. The serrated vines lashed out, not to kill, but to measure. They wrapped around Vane's waist, their thorns piercing his charcoal suit, seeking the rhythm of his blood. "The attic is still threadbare, doctor," I whispered, leaning over him as he fell. In your mind, it is so beautifully ordered, it will make such a wonderful filing system for our more chaotic memories. I felt the matriarch's joy peak. It was a white-hot flare in the center of my being. Vane scrambled for his bag, pulling out a silver scalpel. He slashed at the vines, but they didn't bleed, they leaked ink. The same arachnid script that had branded Alara now began to flow from the wounds in the plants, pooling around Vane's feet. The letters climbed his boots. They whispered to him in the voices of his dead patients, a chorus of medical failures and anatomical curiosities. The body is a temple. The temple is a house. The house is a hunger. "Help me!" Vane cried out, his logic finally shattering like the glass should have. I looked down at him, and for a fleeting second, I remembered the smell of salt and lavender from Alara's mind. I remembered the feeling of being a man who feared the dark. But then, the gears in my head turned. The golden ichor surged. "There is no doctor for this, Silas," I said, my hand. Now a cluster of needles and smoke, reaching for his spectacles. "There is only the integration. You are the cure we've been waiting for." I plucked the glasses from his face. Without them, he saw the truth. He wasn't in a conservatory. He was inside a giant rib-caged lung. The plants were the cilia of the manor, filtering the air for the scent of fear. And I wasn't a man in a veil. I was a shimmering clockwork nightmare, a focal point of all the house's terrible intent. The floor beneath him softened. The quicksand of hair and history rose up to meet him. "Wait!" he gasped, his hands clawing at the tile. I have notes. I have records. I can document this." "Yes," I said, a cold mechanical pride swelling within me. "That is exactly why you are here. Every library needs a cataloger, and every cataloger needs a soul to bind the pages." The great clock struck again. 4. The sound of the bell was the sound of a closing trap. Outside, the horses of the carriage began to dissolve into the mist, their mission complete. The iron gates swung shut with a finality that echoed across the moor. A sound that told the world that Dr. Silas Vane had never existed. In the basement, Julian's song shifted. It gained a new percussive element. The frantic heartbeat of the doctor being slowed down, 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 until it matched the ticking of the manor. I turned away from the sinking man. My work here done for the moment. I had a ledger to update. I had a history to expand. As I walked back toward the library, I felt a new sensation, a tickle in the skin of the West Wing, a draft in a room that hadn't been opened in a century. The manor was stretching. It was hungry again. And somewhere far beyond the mist, another letter was being delivered. The floor of the conservatory did not merely swallow Silas Vane. It digested his relevance. As his knees sank into the tessellated tile, which had grown soft and porous, like the tongue of a great beast, the very air in the room thickened into a translucent amber. Vane's screams were no longer sounds. They were vibrations I could feel in the marrow of my own borrowed bones. Each cry was a thread of silver pulled from his throat, caught by the serrated vines and woven into the lattice of the glass dome above. I watched, my neck clicking with the rhythmic precision of a metronome, as his medical bag began to unmake itself. The leather groaned, stretching and fusing with the calcified roots at his feet. His scalpels, once symbols of his cold, piercing logic, grew long and curved, becoming the thorns of a new metallic briar that sprouted from the floorboards. "You see, Doctor," I whispered, the sound echoing not from my mouth, but from the very panes of glass surrounding us. "In this house, we do not waste the intellect, we simply reassign it." Vane's eyes, stripped of his spectacles, were wide orbs of liquid terror. He looked at his hands. The skin was translucent now, revealing not veins and arteries, but a complex system of copper wiring and vellum scrolls. His fingers were lengthening, hardening into quills. The ink that had pooled around his boots began to defy gravity, weeping upward, staining his trousers, his waistcoat, his very pores, in the cramped, spidery script of 1,000 forgotten tragedies. The manor groaned in satisfaction. It was the sound of a mountain settling, or a giant drawing, a long delayed breath. The violet fire in the drawing room flared, casting long, distorted shadows that danced like ecstatic dervishes across the walls. I turned away before the final stitch was taken. The integration of a mind as rigid as veins was a slow, messy process, and I had no desire to witness the moment his ego finally dissolved into the collective hum of the West Wing. Instead, I drifted, my feet barely touching the floor, which now felt like the velvet back of a sleeping predator, toward the grand staircase. The house was changing again. It happened whenever a new soul was filed. The hallway that led to the library was no longer a straight path. It had curved, the walls bowing outward until the corridor resembled the interior of a massive obsidian ribcage. The portraits on the walls were wet. The oil paint was running, the faces of the previous inhabitants melting into one another to make room for the newcomer. I paused before a frame that had previously held a dour Victorian matron. Now, it showed a silhouette of a man in a doctor's coat, his face a blank expanse of white canvas, waiting for the manor to decide which expression of his agony was most aesthetically pleasing. I reached the library doors. They didn't swing open. They unspooled, the wood grain turning into liquid silk that retreated into the door frames. Inside, the great clock's pendulum was slowing, its heavy thrum-thrum vibrating in my chest cavity. The air smelled of ozone, ancient dust, and the metallic tang of fresh ink. I walked to the central desk, a massive slab of petrified wood that seemed to pulse with a faint internal heat. Upon the desk lay the ledger of the unspoken. Its cover was bound in a material that felt uncomfortably like the skin of a human palm. Warm and slightly damp, I reached out a hand, my fingers flickering between the pale, elegant digits of the librarian and the blackened, skeletal claws of the house's true form, and opened the book. The pages were turning themselves, a frantic rustle like the wings of a trapped bird. They stopped at a fresh leaf. I watched as the ink began to rise from the paper, forming three-dimensional letters that hovered in the air before settling into the grain. Name, Silas Vane. Occupation, anatomist of the superficial. Contribution, the architecture of reason. Status, cataloging in progress. A sharp, cold draft suddenly whipped through the library, extinguishing the candles. In the sudden gloom, the only light came from the golden ichor glowing behind my veil and the faint, phosphorescent shimmer of the books on the shelves. The draft wasn't coming from a window. It was coming from the floor. I looked down. A seam had opened in the rug, a Persian silk masterpiece that depicted a hunt where the stags were winning. Beneath the rug, the floorboards were peeling back like parched skin, a staircase I had never seen before. Narrow, spiral, and carved from what looked like translucent tooth, wound down into a lightless abyss. The tickle I had felt earlier intensified. It was a beckoning. The matriarch's presence in my mind sharpened, her voice a cacophony of 1,000 rusted hinges. The cellar of the mind is overfull, Thorne, but the sub-basement is hollow. It needs the weight of a secret. I began to descend. The air grew colder with every step, a damp, cloying chill that smelled of salt and very old iron. The walls of the spiral staircase were wet, secreting a thick, clear mucus that tasted of copper on the back of my tongue. As I went deeper, the sounds of the manor above, the ticking clock, Julian's distant, rhythmic pounding, the settling of the stones, faded into a heavy, oppressive silence. This was the silenced wing, the place where the manor kept the things it couldn't quite digest at the bottom of the stairs. I found myself in a circular chamber. The walls were lined with jars of all sizes, made of dark, bubbly glass. Inside them, things moved, not creatures but concepts, a flicker of a first love, the sharp, jagged edge of a betrayal, the gray, suffocating fog of a lifelong regret. They were preserved here, kept in stasis, fuel for the house's long, cold winters. In the center of the room stood a pedestal, and upon that pedestal sat a single, unopened letter. It was addressed in a hand that made my mechanical heart skip a beat. The script was elegant, flowing, and utterly impossible. It was Alara's handwriting, but Alara was gone. integrated, woven into the very curtains of the master bedroom. Her voice reduced to the sighing of the wind in the eaves. The letter was sealed with black wax, stamped with a crest I didn't recognize, a weeping eye entwined with a rose of thorns. As my hand neared the envelope, the jars on the walls began to vibrate. The concepts within them grew agitated. The flicker of first love turned into a searing white flame, the betrayal sharpened into a blade that scraped against the glass. "Don't," a voice whispered. It wasn't the matriarch. It wasn't the house. It was a small, fragile voice, buried deep beneath the layers of clockwork and shadow. It was the man I used to be, the one who had loved the woman who became the silk. I ignored him. I was the librarian, and a letter unread was a void in the archive. I broke the seal the moment the wax cracked. The chamber was flooded with a sound so high-pitched it transcended hearing and became a physical pain behind my eyes. It was the sound of 1,000 glass bells shattering at once. I pulled the parchment from the envelope. It wasn't paper. It was a thin, dried membrane, translucent and mapped with fine blue veins. "My dearest Malachi," it began. I froze. Malachi. That was the name the house had made me forget. The name that had been scrubbed from the ledgers and burned from the portraits. If you are reading this, then the integration is complete, and you are the master of nothing but a hungry grave. But there is a secret the matriarch does not know. The manor was not built on stone. It was built on a promise, and promises, like hearts, can be broken from the inside. The ink on the membrane began to crawl. It shifted and reshaped itself, the words melting away to reveal a map. It was a map of the manor, but not as it appeared to the eye. It was a map of its nervous system. I saw the great clock, the heart. I saw the library, the brain, and I saw the west wing, the lungs. But there was a fourth point, a point located beneath the very room where I stood, a point labeled the Well of Echoes. Suddenly the floor beneath the pedestal shuddered. The jars on the walls began to explode, one by one, releasing their trapped regrets into the air like a swarm of invisible locusts. The concepts bit at me, tearing at my veil, whispering my forgotten name into my ears, until I felt my grip on the librarian's persona beginning to slip. The map in my hand glowed with a sickly green light. A path began to burn itself into the floor, a trail of emerald fire leading toward a wall that appeared solid. "Malachi!" The voice was louder now, echoing from the jars, from the walls, from the very air. It was Alara. Not the silk version, not the scream behind the glass, but her. I stepped toward the wall, the map pulsing in sync with the great clock far above. As I touched the stone, it didn't feel like rock, it felt like a scab, hard, crusty, and waiting to be torn away. I pushed. The wall gave way with a wet, tearing sound. Beyond it lay not another room, but a void, a vertical shaft that dropped down into the very foundations of the world, and from the depths of that shaft a new sound rose. It wasn't the ticking of a clock. It wasn't the song of a madman. It was the sound of a heartbeat, a slow, massive, organic thump-thump that made the very bones of the Whispering Manor tremble. The manor wasn't just a house, it was a shell, and whatever was growing inside the Well of Echoes was finally ready to hatch. I looked back at the stairs, thinking of the doctor being turned into a filing system, of Julian pounding his rhythmic warning, of the matriarch's cold, hungry joy. Then I stepped into the dark. The descent was not a fall. It was a transition. The air became thick with the scent of ancient tides and wet earth. I felt the librarian's lace cuffs dissolve, the leaden weight of my human form peeling away like dead skin. My shadow grew, stretching out until it filled the shaft, becoming a cloak of pure, tactile darkness. I reached the bottom, landing on a surface that was soft and yielding, like the moss on a drowned man's chest. I was in a cavern of impossible proportions. The ceiling was lost in a swirling mist of gray vapors, and the walls were encrusted with giant translucent crystals that pulsed with a rhythmic light. In the center of the cavern lay the well. It was a pool of black liquid, its surface as smooth as polished obsidian. But it wasn't water. It was memory in its rawest, most volatile form, and standing on the edge of the pool was a figure. She was tall, her body composed of shifting mists and silver wires. Her face was a mask of porcelain, cracked down the middle, revealing a void of stars within. She held a conductor's baton made of human bone. "Welcome, Malachi," she said, her voice the sound of 1,000 pages turning in a gale. "You are just in time for the rehearsal." I looked into the well, and for the first time since I had become the master of the manor, I felt true, unadulterated cold in the reflection of the black liquid. I didn't see myself, I didn't see the librarian. I saw the manor itself, not as a house but as a suit of armor, and inside the armor a colossal, pale thing was twisting, its many limbs tangled in the plumbing, its eyes peering out through the windows. "The doctor was a necessary vintage," the porcelain woman said, gesturing to the well. "His logic provides the structure. His fear provides the salt. But you provide the soul that binds the spine." She pointed her baton at me, and I felt a sudden violent pull in my chest. The golden ichor, the blood of the house, began to leak from my eyes, my ears, my fingernails. It wasn't being taken from me, it was being summoned. "The manor is not growing, Malachi," she whispered, stepping closer, her star-filled gaze locking onto mine. "It is waking up, and when it stands, the world outside will become the new West Wing." The great clock struck again. 5. The sound didn't come from above. It came from the well. The black liquid began to churn, a shape began to rise, a massive, dripping hand, made of stone, silk, and medical instruments. It reached for the edge of the cavern, its fingers, one of which still wore Silas Vane's signet ring, digging into the mossy earth. I realized then that the letter hadn't been a warning. It had been a lure. Alara's voice, her handwriting, it was all just another dialect the manor had learned to speak to ensure its final evolution. I tried to back away, but my feet were fused to the floor. The copper wiring in my legs had sparked to life, anchoring me to the cavern's pulse. "Don't fight the translation," the woman urged, her porcelain face tilting in a mockery of sympathy. "It's much easier if you simply let go of the shore." The giant hand from the well reached out and closed around my waist. It didn't crush me, it absorbed me. I felt my consciousness expanding, shattering, spreading thin across the entire geography of the manor. I was the creak in the floorboards. I was the draft under the door. I was the violet flame in the hearth and the ink in the ledger. But I was also the thing in the well. And as the 6th chime of the clock began to build in the depths of the earth, I felt a new hunger. A hunger that the doctor's mind could not satisfy. A hunger that the matriarch could not control. I looked through the eyes of the portraits in the hallway. I saw the front doors of the manor. They were opening. Another carriage was approaching through the mist. I felt a surge of cold, mechanical anticipation. I didn't need to write the letters anymore. The manor was now a beacon, a psychic gravity that pulled the lost and the curious toward its iron gates. As the new visitor stepped onto the mosaic foyer, their heel clicking against the image of the Titan and the crows, I didn't say a word. I didn't need to. I simply breathed, and the house breathed with me. The visitor paused, looking up at the shadows of the grandfather clock. "Hello?" they called out, their voice trembling with a delightful, nutritious fear. "Is anyone home?" From the depths of the well, from the heights of the attic, from the very ink in the books, I answered. "We are all home," the manor whispered, "and we have been waiting for you to complete the sentence."